Hi everyone, my name is Herkiv, and I have survived for 1000 days in this hardcore world. However, this isn't just any old typical hardcore world, as I have decided to add a bit of a twist to make it a bit more spicy. Since my level of intelligence leaves a lot to be desired, I thought it would be a fun idea to only be allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. And this isn't the first time I'm attempting this challenge, but rather the third. Based on that fact, you were probably able to guess that I died in my 2 other attempts. However, since I have, for some miraculous reason, managed to make it to 1000 days, I thought I'd go ahead and compile everything that we've gotten up to into a single video. I know, what a refreshing concept, isn't it? Though this means that this video will be really long. However, even if you don't have time to watch it till the end, I would really appreciate it if you would just leave the video running in the background, as it would help me out tremendously. But anyways, let's get into it. Hi everyone, my name is Herkiv, and today we'll be starting our third and most likely final attempt at an incredibly stupid hardcore world where we're only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In the last 2 attempts at this challenge, I have managed to do quite a lot, including building mega bases, automated farms, and so on. However, in both cases, I died in incredibly stupid and anticlimactic ways, which will be something I will attempt to avoid this time. So I created my third world with the incredibly stupid rule of only using wooden tools and leather armor. Once the patience game of waiting for the world to load had finished, I found myself right next to a village, which was an incredibly good start. So like any kind-hearted and gentle man would do, I started breaking into the homes of some innocent civilians to steal all of their hard-earned resources as well as some beds. I then took a brief break from the looting and decided to punch my very first tree of this world. I then went on to craft my very first wooden tools. I decided to go with an axe and a pickaxe, since you always need a pickaxe, and I made the axe to go on with the next task of killing off the village's only protection from the horrific monsters that haunts them during the night. This because it is in our financial interest. So I provoked the iron golem of the village and pillared up on some dirt so that it couldn't fight back, as I bullied it. However, he was rather cheap, as he only gave me 3 iron ingots, which was rather disappointing. But after I had bullied the local golem, I decided to also steal the produce that the village had produced. So I crafted myself a wooden hoe and got to work looting once more. I then set off to find yet another village, since the cheap bastard of an iron golem only dropped 3 pieces of iron, and in order to safely go to the Nether, we needed 4 pieces. Quite luckily, I did manage to find another village a bit further away from spawn, which was very nice. But not only did we find a village, but a lava pool as well, meaning we could start constructing our very first Nether portal. And once the portal was constructed, I got onto looting the next village as well as bullying their iron golem. I then went on to murder all animals I could see to get my hands on even more food, as a stack and a half of hay bales simply wasn't enough for some reason. When we had collected a decent amount of food, I decided that it was time to go through to the Nether. So I went through the portal and unfortunately found myself in my least favorite biome, as it's the home of both variants of aggressive deformed pigs. Then began the incredibly long and painful exploration mission to find a Nether fortress, though I rather quickly ran into a bastion, because of course I did, since we always seem to find bastions when we're looking for fortresses and fortresses when we're looking for bastions. But whilst we were looking for a fortress, I decided that it might be a good idea to grab as much gold as possible, since we can use it to level up clerics, as well as golden apples for when we want to cure villagers. I was then brutally assaulted by a ghast when I was in a soul sand valley, which almost ended my whole career, but thankfully I was just barely able to survive. And after an incredibly painful and long journey through the Nether, I found myself yet another bastion, which was rather frustrating. But after an even longer and more painful journey, we finally managed to find ourselves a Nether fortress. So I instantly started collecting as many blaze rods as I could, but since I am very bad at this game, I almost died. But putting my gaming skills, or rather the lack thereof, I did manage to get myself enough blaze rods to get to the end. So I then began looting the fortress, most likely in the hopes of finding a job in this current labour market. But unfortunately, I left the Nether fortress still very much unemployed, But putting my employment situation aside, I started making my way back to my portal, and whilst on my way, I decided to risk my life on a 4-block jump over lava for absolutely no reason at all. But other than that, the journey back wasn't too bad, since I actually knew where to go and didn't have to wander around like a headless chicken. And once I had successfully made it back to the overworld, I went back to the village where we first spawned. I then threw all of my random junk into a chest and started trading the wheat that I had stolen from them earlier. But after a while, the villagers stopped working for the day, which was rather rude. So I left my bucket of water to destroy their livelihood and grabbed myself a bucket of lava, which I, in turn, used to give the local wildlife a very unpleasant ending. And when the night came, I started killing as many creepers as I could, since we're going to need some rockets for when we get our elytra. However, once the day came, I realized that we didn't get enough emeralds from trading our stolen goods, so I had to trade some sticks to a Fletcher. Though this wasn't that big of a problem, since we needed a Fletcher anyway, since it might be a good idea to have a bow and some arrows when we go to the end. But once all trades had been successfully dealt with, I decided to set off to find the stronghold. Though as I left the village, I noticed that there was a pillager patrol right next to the village, but I rather quickly decided that it wasn't my problem and continued on my way. However, once I had arrived at the place the eyes had led me, I realized that the stronghold was under the ocean, which was rather annoying. But nonetheless, I started digging, and after not too much digging, I arrived at the stronghold, meaning the next objective was to find the portal, which is usually a bit of a pain. And this time was no different, as I spent 6 minutes running through a dank basement to find the damn portal. I know 6 minutes doesn't sound like a very long time, but I happened to have the patience of a grumpy toddler on a plane. So I once again placed down a chest and threw all of my random junk that I wouldn't need for the dragon fight, and set my spawn using one of the beds that I had stolen from the village at our spawn. I then thought that it might be a good idea to craft some armor, so I used the leather that we had acquired in a very humane and ethical way on our way to the stronghold. However, I then realized that I had used my bucket to pick up lava, which wasn't going to be that useful in the end, so I ran off and grabbed some water instead. Then all the preparations were done, and I jumped through to the end, only to be faced with the incredibly fun and engaging task of slowly mining endstone with an unenchanted wooden pickaxe. But eventually, I made it out of the pit that we spawned in, and started the dragon fight. And once the dragon had been rather epically dealt with, I decided to steal the dragon egg to make a lamp or something in the future. I then wasted no time at all and made my way through the portal that we had just unlocked. I then set my FOV to Quake Pro and managed to spot 2 end cities, but neither of them seemed to have a ship, which was rather disappointing. And since the end cities had no ship, I decided to activate my second brain cell and came to the conclusion that I shouldn't risk my life unless there's an elytra. So I decided to only take out the shulkers by the entrances and left to find an end city with a ship. And after a rather long but not too long adventure, I did manage to find an end city that had a ship, which was very exciting. So I pillared my way over and grabbed myself the very first pair of wings in this world. And since I am a very greedy man, I decided that I would continue my adventure in the end and went on to raid a bunch of end cities. and after my immense greed had been somewhat satiated, I decided to return back to the overworld. And once I was back, I located the libraries and grabbed all the books I could get my slimy and greedy hands on. And once I had my pockets full of stolen goods, I jumped back to the end and went back to my spawn. Now came the task of exploring the overworld, as I needed somewhere I could settle down and build my starter base. I did, however, have some requirements since I am a very picky person. My main requirements was that there has to be a pillager outpost near the place I am settling down, and there also has to be an ocean. The reason for this is quite simple. Since I am incredibly bad at this game, I tend to die rather often and in rather embarrassing ways, so my only hope of making it to a somewhat respectable playtime in this world. I'm going to need a bunch of totems of undying, so I need to build a raid farm soon. However, shortly after I had started looking for such a place, my elytra broke mid-flight, which in normal circumstances would have led to my very swift death. But for some miraculous reason, it decided to break when I wasn't very high up, leading to my rather surprising survival. And after flying for a rather long time, I found myself the first pillager outpost of this world. However, it was located in a cold biome, so all the nearby water was frozen, which wasn't going to work for me. So I continued flying and found another one quite nearby, and this one actually had some scarecrows, which was very nice. I decided to rush in and loot the pillager outpost, as they had a horn, which I instantly used to establish my dominance as the alpha male. I also stole their carved pumpkins, since we're most definitely going to need them in the future, and once I had stolen all of the pillager stuff, I noticed that the outpost had both a normal ocean as well as a village nearby, meaning that we had finally found the place where we were going to settle down in the early game. Hi everyone, my name is Herkiv, and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In last week's episode, we took down the Ender Dragon and grabbed ourselves our first elytra. However, I still don't have a base of operations yet, which is an issue I thought would be a good idea to deal with. However, before getting too productive, I thought it was a good idea to go and grab some wood, as we might need it in the future. But once we had stolen enough wood from Mother Nature, I got to start building our starter base. The starter base I decided to build is very on-brand for this channel, as it is incredibly inconvenient and unnecessarily annoying to build, as we're going to build it underwater. However, I did have a reason to choose such an incredibly stupid and tedious starter base, as I thought it would be nice to have a consistent theme in this world, instead of just throwing random bullshit and hoping for the best. And the theme that I have chosen for this world is water, more specifically, the ocean. So both my starter base and my main mega base will be ocean themed, which I thought would be rather nice. However, one thing that I hadn't considered whilst conjuring up my master plan was that I wouldn't have access to enchanted tools, so mining out a livable area under the water would be incredibly tedious. So I had to spend a bunch of time just mining a bunch of blocks using unenchanted wooden tools, which was just as fun and amusing as you can imagine. However, after a while, I had successfully mined out a small area at the bottom of the ocean and started decorating it a tiny bit in hopes of making it somewhat habitable. I then built a very caveman-like setup with chests and got started with the fun task of sorting the few items I had into their correct places. And once we had a somewhat habitable area, I got started expanding our on-site amenities. So I once again started mining out a bunch of blocks using unenchanted wooden tools, which was just as fun as last time. In order for me to actually have a halfway decent shot at surviving in this world, I'm going to need quite a few things to start off with. And the first thing that I thought would be good to tackle was a villager breeder, as there is nothing more profitable than slavery in this game. So once I had mined out a tiny bit of our future corridor, I started mining out the space to fit the aforementioned villager breeder, and whilst I was being a very good and productive boy, I also had some sand that I decided to smelt into glass, which I thought was very clever. So now we had some glass that we could use for our roof for our underwater base, which I thought would be rather cool. However, just as I started placing down my glass, I was ambushed by a drowned with a trident, which was a rather significant issue that I had been too lazy and absent-minded to consider earlier. I then came to the horrific realization that one hit with a trident is enough to take about half of our HP when wearing full leather armor, which was, safe to say, rather concerning. However, since the drowned are pretty much hard countered by a shield, I did manage to deal with the intruder. However, once the drowned had been dealt with, I also discovered that I was about as good at holding my breath as someone who has been smoking from the age of 4. So building the roof from my underwater base was going to be even more annoying than I had originally planned. However, since I always underestimate how much materials I need, I was a bit short on glass to actually finish the roof, so I had to grab a bit more sand and set it to smelt in our furnace. And whilst we were waiting for our glass to smelt, I started placing some of our gravel to drain the water out of our roof. But eventually, I did manage to place in all of the glass for our roof and drain all of the water, which was a task that was very nice to no longer have to attend to. And now that our roof had been masterfully dealt with, I continued work on our villager breeder, and once the farm was close to being complete, I ran off to the village right by where we had settled and stole some beds. I also kidnapped a few villagers to initiate the endless cycle of brutality that was about to take place in my home. The process of getting the kidnapping victims into their new forever home was actually significantly easier than I had initially thought, which was a very welcome surprise. And once the last details had been added to the villager breeder, the only thing we had left to do in terms of our slavery operation was to get us a zombie who would zombify our villagers. So I punched out all of the torches in our main room and waited for a zombie to spawn. This took significantly longer than I had initially thought, which was rather annoying. But eventually, we did get a bunch of zombies to spawn, which was very exciting. So I got one of the zombies into his designated hole and lit up the base once more. However, since I have an IQ that is about as high as the average math scores in public schools, I had completely forgotten to check if the zombie could pick up an item, which he, of course, couldn't. So I had to kill that freshly captured mental peer of mine and do the same thing all over again. And after waiting for what felt like an eternity, we did manage to get a zombie that could pick up an item. So I captured him and got on to doing some preparations. Since we're going to want to cure our villagers to get some decent deals, we're going to need potions of weakness, which we're going to need both brown mushrooms and spider eyes to make. So I headed over to the nearby tiger forest and grabbed myself some brown mushrooms. I then realized that we didn't have a sugarcane farm, so I grabbed and planted some on the shore by our base, since I was significantly too lazy to dig out an area to have it growing in our actual base. It then switched over to nighttime, which I spent by killing spiders for their spider eyes and creepers, as we're going to need gunpowder for both brewing and some rockets, so that we can actually use our elytra that we spent the entirety of last episode getting. All that was left to get for us to be able to brew potions of weakness was water bottles. And since I am incredibly cheap, I decided to drink some of the health potions that we had gotten in the end, so that I wouldn't have to spend any precious glass to make water bottles. And now that all the preparations for our villages were complete, I decided to kidnap yet another civilian, which we will use for even further financial gain in the future. So I grabbed him and transported him to the middle of the ocean to then box him in using a bunch of dirt. Since all we had to do at this point was to wait for our villager breeder to pump out some babies, I decided to be even more productive and started gathering all of the materials we would need for one of our next farms that we will desperately need for our survival. And once I had been a very productive and good boy, I placed some signs and decided what kind of enchantments I was going to prioritize and went to FK to let the prisoners in my villager breeder do their thing. And once I got back, I was assaulted by some skeletons who had apparently swum over to my front door to harass me. But once the unwelcome guests had been properly dealt with, I converted some of our villagers to zombies to then turn them back into villagers, so that they believe that I am their savior rather than their brutal overlord. I then got to every Minecraft player's favorite task of re-rolling librarian trades until I got the enchantments I wanted. But after a very long time of breaking and placing lecterns, I finally got all of the enchantments that I wanted to start out with. So I enchanted some of my stuff and got to work digging out an area for our iron farm. But this time, I had an efficiency 5 pickaxe, which made me want to die a bit less. And once we had made a decent amount of progress on digging out our future iron farm, I thought that it might be a good idea to enchant my armor as well, so that we don't get absolutely annihilated. Hi everyone, my name is Herkif, and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world, where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In today's episode, we're going to tackle a few things in order to not die like an absolute noob, and in order to not die, I'm going to need significantly better armor as well as totems of undying, as I tend to do very stupid things for absolutely no reason. But since we're going to need quite a lot of totems, emeralds and XP to deal with my aforementioned dying problem, I thought it'd be best to try to get a raid farm up and running as fast as possible. So I swam over to the villager who we ripped away from his family and home and got started building our raid farm. The raid farm I'm building is the same as I always build, as it is the cheapest and probably one of the easiest designs out there, which at the moment is rather important, as I am very lazy and impatient. And after having constructed the raid farm, I decided to go and get Bad Omen to give it a bit of a test drive. I then wasted no time at all and jumped right into our project that we didn't manage to finish last episode, which is our iron farm. One of the things that we didn't manage to get done in our last episode was to capture a zombie who will spend the remainder of his life terrorizing a bunch of civilians so that I may move on to a more lavish lifestyle. This was, just like in last episode, rather mundane, as I simply stood at the end of my corridor waiting for a mental peer of mine to spawn, and after a while we managed to get both a mental peer of mine as well as a friendly neighborhood splody boy to spawn. So I lured the mental peer of mine into a hole using the legendary power of trapdoors. However, the power of the trapdoor was too powerful, as it also made the friendly neighborhood splody boy get in the hole as well, so I had to kill him with immaculate precision in order to not harm the zombie. I then tended to a few guests who were hanging out in my home and started lighting up my room once again with immense confidence, as I had successfully done something useful. However, that confidence died rather quickly, as I soon realized that the zombie that I had lured into my hole had completely ignored the boat that I had placed down for him and simply stood on top of it. And when I tried getting him to walk towards me in hopes of him getting into the damn boat I had given him, I realized that he had managed to get stuck on top of the boat, which was rather frustrating. So I killed the zombie and got back to waiting for a new one to spawn. And after having waited incredibly patiently, and dare I say epically, for 10 minutes, I did manage to get a new zombie to spawn. So I lured him down into my hole, and to my relief, this mental peer of mine was slightly smarter than our last one, as this one actually knew how to sit down in a boat. With said marvelous news, I filled in the hole that we had dug out, as we would no longer need it. However, since the game seems to absolutely despise me, our villager breeder seemed to have stopped working, which I found to be rather strange. So I entered my villager breeder and found that the baby that had been produced had somehow grown up and could no longer fit in the hole that I would normally have them fall into. So I did what every kind-hearted and honourable man would do and killed off the grown-up baby in front of their parents. And with that heroic deed done, I went to AFK, to once again let the baby makers do their thing. And after a while AFK, I transported some of our villagers into the scaring chamber of our iron farm. And it is my absolute pleasure to announce that the villagers are now living in perennial terror, which is very good for our financial well-being. and whilst we were strengthening our financial situation, I decided to go to the Nether to grab myself some gold. So I flew around and gathered a bunch of gold ores that we apparently can smelt into gold ingots, which I had absolutely no idea you could do before I was informed by Garlic Bread 9484. Huge props if you're watching this. I then got back to the overworld and started smelting the gold ore, and I did this using lava instead of coal or wood, since I am the living embodiment of poverty in this world. And whilst I was waiting for our gold to smelt, I decided to go chop down some oak trees in hopes of getting some apples for our golden apples, since that was the whole reason behind our rather epic excursion in the Nether. And once I had grabbed myself some apples, I crafted up some golden apples, which meant that we could get even more librarians for enchantments. However, just as I least expected it, our iron farm made yet another appearance, as the zombie managed to die somehow. I had absolutely no idea if the zombie died or if it despawned, but the main point is that the zombie was gone. So I went back to, once again, trying to get a zombie to spawn in our base. And after what felt like 5 decades, we managed to get a pack of zombies to spawn. But this time, I decided to be extra safe, not by using a thicker contraceptive, but by throwing a piece of dirt on the ground, hoping that one of the zombies would pick it up. That way, the zombie shouldn't be able to despawn. I then dealt with the remaining friendly neighborhood cannibals, but didn't bother filling in the hole, as the game has made it abundantly clear that it doesn't like me very much. And whilst I was fixing random bullshit in my base, I came to the realization that I still didn't have a bedroom, as I had been sleeping in my chest room like an absolute peasant. So I decided to mine out a bedroom for myself. I then started decorating a tiny bit around the base by putting in an actual floor in hopes of making my base a tiny bit more presentable. Our base in general is rather inconvenient, which is very much on brand for this channel. However, in an attempt to make my incredibly inconvenient base a tiny bit more convenient, I decided that it was probably time to put in a nether portal in our base so that we won't have to swim and fly to our nether portal like some kind of peasant. However, since the game doesn't particularly like me, it decided to create my portal in the air above an ocean of lava, which was rather inconvenient. But with the horrendous news about our portal spawn, I got to actually using the golden apples that we had collected earlier by curing another batch of future librarians, and then began this world's second session of placing and breaking lecterns to get the remaining enchantments that I wanted. And now that we had quite a few different enchantments, I decided to label our librarians, so that we won't have to shuffle through them like an absolute knob every time we want to enchant something. But in order to actually apply the enchantments that we had gotten from our villager, we needed to get some XP. So I flew over to our raid farm and started grinding, and after we had used our very humane and ethical extermination device, I dove back into the Nether with a new mission to collect magma. The reason I needed to collect magma was to make a gold farm, which is the final farm that we needed to build in this episode. The reason for that is that we're going to need quite a bit of obsidian, which I intended to obtain through piglin bartering, which we're going to need a ton of gold for. However, after barely any magma mining, I came to the awful realization that the full durability of our pickaxe was only enough to get slightly more than 3 stacks of magma, which was rather concerning. So I decided to enchant yet another pickaxe of the fortune variety, as I would be able to repair it by mining quartz in the Nether, which I thought was very smart. But after having used our raid farm once again to enchant our new pickaxe, I dove back into the Nether once more to hopefully collect a decent amount of magma. Once the incredibly adventurous gathering session of magma had been completed, I flew off in search of the next material we would need for our gold farm, that being turtle eggs. So I brutally slaughtered an innocent turtle, who possibly had a family, to then force feed its crusty remains to some other turtles so that they would get in the mood to reproduce. I then watched the turtles have their intimate moment and stole their babies, who I will use in my next industrial level slaughterhouse. And after a bit more gathering, we had managed to get all of the materials we would need to construct our gold farm. So I popped through to the Nether yet again and started pillaring up to make my way to the roof of the Nether. I then flew around for a bit in search of finding a good spot to build our gold farm, and once I had found a spot, I got on to building the farm. Hi everyone, my name is Herkef, and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. Today, we're starting off in the Nether, as we currently have no way to get back to the overworld. So in order to negate that rather anxiety-inducing issue, we have to build a bartering farm in order to get obsidian as well as fire charges. And once the bartering farm and its storage system had been properly dealt with, I got on to catching myself a piglin who I would enslave to save my own life, and by an absolute miracle, I did manage to get a piglin to spawn rather quickly. And not only that, he also ran straight into my trap that I had set up for him using the supreme power of a trapdoor, making the process incredibly smooth. However, we also got a baby piglin to spawn, for which I chose to not show any mercy whatsoever. With the process of procuring my bartering slave going so smoothly, my confidence went through the roof as I had successfully secured a way for me to get back home. But that confidence and ecstasy didn't last particularly long, as I was quickly humbled by the fact that I had completely forgotten to bring name tags to prevent the piglin from despawning. With that rather disappointing situation aside, I got on to making sure that the item filters I had connected to my bartering farm got the correct items sorted, and after a bit of waiting, we had successfully gotten ourselves enough obsidian to get back to the overworld, which was very welcome news, as the time I spent in the Nether was about as pleasant as stepping on Lego on your way to eat cheese from the fridge at 4 AM. So I flew to the coordinates to link up to the portal in my base that I definitely calculated by myself and didn't use an external website to get, since I'm not a lazy person in the slightest. And with that, I got back to my humble abode. I then immediately bought myself 2 name tags that we would use to prevent our future piglins from despawning. I decided to name the first one Harold, as that was the first name I could think of. And since I'm about as imaginative as an average government employee, I decided to name the second one Harold II. I then reluctantly went back to the Nether to finish our bartering farm, as we're going to need it for our upcoming projects. I then rebuilt the spawning platform for our piglins, which I had taken down earlier for some reason I can't explain, and got back to the incredibly thrilling and engaging content of waiting for piglins to spawn. And after having waited patiently like a good boy, I managed to get a few piglins to spawn and captured them like the animals that they are. I then pushed a bunch of zombified piglins off from my spawning platform to have them plummet to their deaths in a very humane and vegan way. However, once I had removed the spawning platform, I realized that there were a few babies in the hole dedicated to Harold II, which was rather annoying. So I flew away to get them to despawn, like the very capable and intelligent human that I am. I then tried activating my now fully operational bartering farm, but fell like the absolute bellend that I am. But on my second try, I did manage to flick a lever, which was a rather big accomplishment for my standards, and after having spent a monstrous amount of time AFK, I got back to a pretty decent amount of obsidian, which was the main reason why I needed the bartering farm. So I once again returned to the overworld with my pockets full of spoils from my latest slavery operation. But before moving on to the other things we need for our next project, I decided to upgrade our storage for our raid farm, as it was feeding into a single double chest, which I thought was a bit too much of a peasant-like setup for me, now that I was a proper big shot. And after having upgraded our storage system for our raid farm, I set off on a new mission to find Pillager Outpost, as we are going to need carved pumpkins for our next project. But after having explored for what felt like a decade, we only managed to get a total of 9 carved pumpkins, which was rather disappointing. But I decided that 9 pumpkins would have to be enough, as I was significantly too lazy and impatient to explore any further. The next project we'll be tackling is a shulker farm. The reason we're building that is because we're going to need a ton of resources for our future mega base. And in order to transport a ton of resources, we're going to need a lot of shulkers, as I don't intend to fly back and forth just to move materials, as I am no longer a peasant. But in order to get a shulker farm up and running, we're going to need to bring a shulker to the overworld, which is always an incredibly annoying ordeal. But since I don't want to fly back and forth for my materials like a peasant, it simply had to be done. So I flew to the coordinates that I had noted down for our stronghold and made my way to the end. I then spent the next 4 minutes and 30 seconds looking for an end city that was located close to an end gateway. I then got to the task of transporting some shulkers to the end gateway. This process went rather smoothly, as I managed to grab 2 shulkers with no bigger issues. But then began the most grueling and frustrating task of this whole operation, as we would now have to get a shulker through the end portal, which for some reason never goes smoothly. So I then got to placing a bunch of buttons all over the end portal, as well as the surrounding area, in hopes of preventing the shulkers from teleporting anywhere outside of the portal. I then set up the rail system and got to actually trying to transport the shulkers. But just like every time, the shulker managed to teleport onto a block that had a redstone torch on it, which shouldn't be possible. And whilst I was struggling for my life to transport this incredibly stupid mob, it managed to die for some weird unknown reason, which was incredibly frustrating. This meant that I would have to get the first shulker that I transported to go through the portal without dying, which was a rather tall order. So I thought of the idea of replacing the redstone torch with a button. That way, it would hopefully not be able to teleport to the same spot it did before. However, as I tried to get the shulker back to the spot with the activator rail, the shulker somehow got stuck and couldn't move, even though it was in a minecart, which shouldn't be possible. And after a while of trying to free the shulker, it decided to shoot itself until it died, just like all of my pets. This is the reason why I absolutely despise moving shulkers. So I had to go back to the outer end once again to grab myself another shulker, which was incredibly frustrating. But this time, I decided to be a bit smarter with it and decided to send a minecart with a furnace through to the main island, as that would hopefully push the shulker all the way to the end portal. And to my surprise, my plan actually worked, meaning all I had to do was to push the button to have the shulker go through to the overworld. But since the game decided that I should consume excrement, the shulker teleported to the exact same spot as before, even though I had placed a button there, meaning it, once again, should be impossible for the shulker to teleport there. So I tried placing a bottom slab on top of the spot where it had teleported, but that didn't stop the shulker from, once again, teleporting to a place where it shouldn't be possible to teleport. So I tried making the slab a full block and placed a button on it, but that didn't work either. I then tried placing a block where the shulker kept teleporting to, and this, for some weird reason, actually worked. And with that, I would hopefully never have to transport a shulker to the overworld again in this world, which was a massive relief. But our job here wasn't done, as we still had to actually construct the shulker farm. So I jumped into the end portal and got back to where I initially spawned and started work on the farm. And now that our shulker farm was complete, and we had an infinite source of shulker shells, I started preparing for our next project, which will be a guardian farm. As I mentioned a few episodes ago, this world will mainly be ocean themed, so I thought it would make sense and be rather cool to build our mega base out of prismarine. So I managed to find a tutorial for an incredibly efficient yet very simple guardian farm by Shulkercraft, where I didn't have to drain anything, which was very promising, as I died last time I tried to drain an ocean monument. But in order to tackle this next project, I needed to make a few preparations. One of those aforementioned preparations was to brew up some potions, so that I won't get bullied by the inhabitants against whom I'm about to commit genocide. And in order to brew the potions I needed, I had to go back to the Nether and grab some nether wart, which went surprisingly smoothly. I then got back to the safety of my humble abode and started brewing up all the potions that I would need. And once the incredibly adventurous and thrilling task of staring at a brewing stand was dealt with, I grabbed the last resources I would need and went off to locate an ocean temple. And once there, I went in to kill off all of the Elder Guardians to fully establish my dominance over some random NPCs. And after I had masterfully dealt with the Elder Guardians with some assistance from a birch door, I was rather pleasantly surprised to find 2 sponge rooms, which was very exciting. But since I'm about as sharp as a marble, I forgot to bring a bucket of milk, meaning I had to patiently wait for the mining fatigue to wear off. But once it had worn off and I had collected all of the precious sponge, I got to the construction of the Guardian farm. Hi everyone, my name is Herkiv, and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In the last episode, we built a bunch of farms in order to not hate our lives quite as much as before. Included in said farms is a guardian farm, which means that we now have a basically infinite supply of building materials in the form of prismarine. And since we've spent some time AFK like the very lazy man that I am, we have actually gotten quite a few resources since last time. So in today's episode, we're going to try to get as much progress done as possible on our first big project of this world, which will be our mega base. And a bit of a spoiler, this episode is going to be very time-lapse heavy, but anyways, I used some of the shulkers that we had gotten from our shulker farm and got to crafting up some of the prismarine that we will need for our project. However, I chose to not record the crafting session as that would probably be the Minecraft equivalent of watching paint dry. So then began our adventure to find a decent spot to build our mega base. I only had a few requirements here as I wanted it to be placed on top of a coral reef. I am not entirely sure why I needed it to be on top of a coral reef, but here we are. I also wanted my mega base to be a tiny bit closer to spawn, as we had built our starter base at an annoyingly long distance from our spawn, which is where we have our shulker farm. So it would be nice to not have to fly back and forth like an absolute knob every time I want some more shulkers. And quite luckily, we did manage to find a coral reef relatively close to spawn, meaning we had found our new home where we would manage all of our immoral operations from in the future. The base I have decided to build will be mainly built using prismarine, as I wanted to continue our rather annoying and cumbersome ocean theme. However, since I am rather stupid and regularly do things that come back to haunt me, I had decided to build my base suspended in the air above the ocean. And after what felt like 3 hours, 31 minutes and 45 seconds, we had finally finished our first platform where our main base of operations will be placed. My plan for this build is to have a center platform, where I will build a structure that will hopefully be large enough to fit my entire ego and have it surrounded by smaller platforms that will house my future immoral operations. However, since I am still somewhat of a peasant, I still didn't have a decent source of food, so I had to fly back to my starter base once more. And whilst I was flying back to my base, I came to the realization that I hate my life and decided to make it a tiny bit more bearable by installing a nether portal at my future mega base. And once that was set up, I started marking the footprint of our future structure that will go on top of our platform. That way, we would actually somewhat know what we're doing. But now that we have actually made a tiny bit of progress on the actual platform, I needed to go on a new adventure to get a lot of netherrack, as I intended to use it for the floor of our platform. And now you might be thinking to yourself, why use netherrack? Won't it be really ugly with the prismarine? To which I respond, YOLO. However, in order to be able to get my hands on that kind of volume of netherrack, I would need to get a bunch more pickaxes, as I only had 2 pickaxes that were somewhat usable. So I once again went back to my raid farm and enchanted a bunch of pickaxes. I then went to the nether to start collecting a bunch of netherrack, which was just as exciting and thrilling as it always is to mindlessly mine a ton of blocks. But once I had collected a somewhat decent amount of netherrack, I got to the even more fun and exciting task of placing it. However, in a not very surprising turn of events, I had once again underestimated how much materials that I would actually need, so I had to go back to the nether once more to grab even more netherrack, But once I had solved the netherrack situation, we did manage to finish up the flooring of our main platform, which was very exciting. So since we had our footprint laid out and our flooring somewhat dealt with, I decided to start building our main structure. However, I ran into an issue rather quickly. I had completely ran out of food, which made me realize that my priorities may have been rather suboptimal. So I flew back to my starter base and harvested some of the local wildlife out of pure desperation. However, I was quickly humbled as I got outplayed by a sheep who made me drop a bucket of lava on myself. But with that rather embarrassing turn of events, I went to FK once more at my guardian farm, as the giant monstrosity of a build that I've decided to take on required significantly more resources than I currently had. I then got back to working on my absolute monstrosity of a build that is certainly not compensating for anything. And after having gotten quite a lot of the main structure dealt with, I came to the rude realization that it was looking rather bad, the main issue being that the spikes that I had built basically just blended in together with our main structure, which made it look rather messy. I had absolutely no idea of how I would deal with the issue, so I decided to build a giant teat on top of my main structure to give me some time to think. And once the teat with the violently erect nipple had been dealt with, I actually came up with an idea that could solve our issue with the spikes. My idea was to outline our spikes using quartz, which, rather surprisingly, actually made it look significantly better. And with the giant teat and the spikes outlined with quartz, the structure actually looked pretty cool, which was a massive relief given how it looked during the building process. And with the main structure pretty much done in terms of exterior, I wasted no time at all and got to building the other platforms, as we're going to need them quite soon. Hi everyone, my name is Herkif, and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In our last episode, we managed to make a lot of progress on our biggest project yet, which is my mega base. However, we're still quite far from being done, as we still need to build the structures to go on the smaller platforms we built in our last episode. So even though I said that this episode would be less time-lapse heavy, we're starting off with yet another time-lapse. And as yet another spoiler, this episode will be rather time-lapse heavy as well, so ignore what I said at the end of our last episode. This is probably the most time-lapse heavy episode that I have ever made, but hopefully we'll keep it a bit lighter for our next episode. Since I have about the same level of estimation skills as a tipsy modern art appraiser, I will definitely have to go back on what I said in our last clip. So anyways, here's another time-lapse. And after our first out of 4 towers had been masterfully dealt with, I came to the realization that I had, as per usual, completely underestimated how much materials I would need for this project. Defeated, I had to fly around in the desert and manually collect cactus so that I would be able to make cyan dye. I then made my way back to my starter base and abused the second-class citizens who were residing in my basement to get my slimy hands on some glass. And after having gathered a full shulker of glass, I decided that I couldn't be bothered to gather anymore. So I made my way back to my mega base in high hopes that one shulker of glass would be enough, knowing damn well that it most certainly won't be. So back I went to build the towers which would house my future abominable axe that will quite likely not be compliant with the Geneva Conventions. But about halfway through finishing our second tower, I noticed 2 things that were rather concerning. The first thing being that I had completely run out of dark prismarine, which is the most expensive variant of prismarine. The second thing being that I was about to run out of rockets, since I kept using them whilst building. So I had to make my way back to our starter base once again, and started killing some creepers for their juicy and borderline erotic gunpowder. However, this wasn't very successful, as I barely managed to get any gunpowder at all. So I decided to go back to using my raid farm to hopefully get some gunpowder from the witches. As you can imagine, this took a very long time, but after what felt like 2.5 lifetimes, I finally finished building our second tower. However, since I am rather stupid and absent-minded, I completely forgot to record finishing the tower. But anyways, now that we have 2 out of the 4 towers built, you can start to see what the mega base will look like in its entirety, which I was rather happy with. I even turned on shaders to properly stroke my immense ego. However, at this point I was rather fed up building the towers and decided to move on to something different. That being the interior of our main structure. My plan for this part of the mega base is to expand our slavery operation. In other words, I will build a massive villager trading hall. So I designed the interior for this part of the mega base to accommodate our future trading hall. And after a few hours of building, we ended up with a pretty decent interior that I was rather happy with. However, even after having spent a few hours on our interior, I still didn't feel like building the rest of the towers, so I decided to build the villager breeder that will be feeding into all of our farms and our villager trading hall. But now that our villager breeder was built, there was still an issue we had to deal with. Since I decided to make the very intelligent decision to build my base in the air, which is one of the most inconvenient places to build a base, it would be really hard and annoying to transport villagers to it. So my only real option was to grab a few villagers from our starter base and transport them directly into the villager breeder via the Nether. So I built a portal right in our villager breeder and started transporting the villagers. And quite surprisingly, this process went quite smoothly, which was a very pleasant surprise. And now that our villager breeder was fully set up and ready to fuel our morally indefensible operations, I had grown really tired of having to keep going back to our starter base, so I decided that I should probably add some actual functions to our mega base to make us less dependent on our starter base. I know, I'm a genius, so I started building some rough interiors for one of our towers so that I could get to building a few farms in it. And when I had built a really basic interior including a floor, I got started building an iron farm, which would soon be our first farm of our mega base, except from our villager breeder. Please ignore that. The reason why I started us off with an iron farm was quite simple. We are going to need a lot of hoppers to build the rest of our farms, which means that we're going to need a lot of iron. And since I am very lazy and probably mildly autistic, I decided to build the exact same iron farm, as I always do, as I didn't see any reason not to. My intention for these towers is to build all of the farms that we will need going forward, so they will all have their own storage which the farms will feed into. So the intention is to build multiple farms in each tower in order to be a bit more efficient. But since we're having all of the items going into the same storage, I had to use water streams to transport the items, so I flew over to my starter base once more to pick up some regular and blue ice. And went back to finish our iron farm. So once our iron farm was up and running, I wasted no time at all and started work on the second farm in our tower, which would be a cactus farm. The reason I went for a cactus farm was mainly because we will need cyan dye for our glass. And since I was rather tired of flying around in the desert to manually collect cactus like an absolute peasant, I thought having a cactus farm would be quite nice. And just like our iron farm, I decided to go for the exact same design as I always do for cactus farms. I have absolutely no idea who came up with the design, but if you recognize it, feel free to let me know. And once the cactus farm was fully operational, I noticed an issue with the iron farm, which honestly wasn't very surprising, since something always seems to go wrong whenever I build iron farms. The issue was that the iron golems could spawn outside of the spawning platform, so I put a bunch of slabs on all of the areas they could spawn, which thankfully fixed the issue. However, I also noticed that the iron golems would sometimes spawn on a block where they would suffocate, which was rather concerning. However, since I couldn't be bothered to fix it, I decided to pretend that I didn't see it in hopes that the issue would somehow resolve itself, knowing damn well that the issue won't ever be resolved. So instead of dealing with the problem with my iron farm, I decided to move on to the next farm, which is probably the most important one in this episode. And the next farm I built was a mob farm. The reason I needed a mob farm was because I needed a reasonable source of gunpowder, as I had been killing creepers and using the raid farm up until now like some sort of second-class citizen. So I chopped down a ton of trees, which I needed to make all of the chests needed for our farms. I then repeated the same interior process as our last tower to make it a tiny bit more presentable, and got started on our mob farm. And as you could probably guess, I decided to go for the same mob farm that I always go for. This farm also happens to be the main farm that I wanted to finish in this episode, as our supply of rockets, or rather the lack thereof, has been incredibly annoying. And the design of the smaller towers that we have built are actually specifically designed to fit this exact mob farm that we are building. But not only that, in addition to our desperate need for gunpowder, we will also need a ton of bones, since we will need it for our main platform in the future. But now you might be wondering, why didn't I build a mob farm earlier? And to that I would respond that I for some reason thought it would be a good idea to hold off until I built my mega base. My reasoning for this was that if I built it earlier, then I would probably have to build another at my mega base anyways, meaning I would have to build the same farm twice. So instead of building the mob farm twice, which any sane person would, I spent all of my time so far without a decent source of gunpowder, which most certainly was an incredibly stupid move. But you might think that, on the bright side, I would have learned a lesson from this incredibly stupid situation. But as many of you who have seen my videos before will know, that will not be the case. But now that we finally had our precious mob farm up and running, which would surely be our ticket out of my crippling depression, I decided that I should probably go back to building the rest of the towers, which I had put off for quite a while. Hi everyone, my name is Herkif and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In our last episode, we continued work on our mega base and actually managed to get quite a lot done. However, there's still an issue that remains, and that is that it's basically just a huge facade and doesn't have the most basic things that every base should have, such as a storage room, bedroom, etc. So in today's episode, I want to work a bit on our base's habitability, as well as getting our villagers set up. I have absolutely no idea if habitability is a real word, but I am significantly too lazy to Google it. So the first thing we had to deal with was to create a way for us to actually access the majority of the interior of our mega base, as that may come in handy. My idea was that the center of our soon-to-be villager trading hall would be a bubble elevator, which would lead to the living area of the base. But in order to do that, I had to get rid of the remains of our previous Nether portal, which was a very thrilling adventure in and of itself. I then built a small elevation in our floor for our elevator in hopes of making it somewhat acceptable to look at. And once we had a way up to our future living area, I noticed that we didn't have a way to get back down, which was a bit of an issue, so I tinkered a bit with the positioning and managed to make a way to get down as well. I then decided to test our drop chute and managed to somehow miss, so I decided to add the rest of the safety measures, as it would be incredibly embarrassing if that would be the cause of my future death. But with both our bubble elevator as well as our drop chute completed, I started work on our floor, for which I decided to do an outline of prismarine bricks and fill in with normal prismarine. I also made sure to make doorways leading into our quarter circle shaped rooms, which would surely not be incredibly annoying to deal with, due to their incredibly inconvenient shape. I then replicated the exact same prismarine brick framing as I did with our first floor, but I had absolutely no idea what to build the next floor out of, so I decided to ignore it for now and hope that I would somehow come up with an absolutely world-changing concept which would make all professional Minecraft builders jealous. So I started making some preparations for our first floor. My plans for this first floor was to make it my storage area. So I built some frames to accommodate our chests and added a simple design to our walls. However, that ended up looking about as pleasant as a pile of rotting pineapples, so I decided to go for a different design, and in hopes of making my floor a bit more presentable and less boring, I decided to come in with some more prismarine bricks, as well as sea lanterns to break up the vast sea of prismarine. I then thought I would try to fill in the second floor using birch planks, as I thought it might pair quite well with the prismarine. However, I rather quickly realized that my previous hypothesis was very off, so I continued building the prismarine brick frames to mark out all of the floors so that I would have a vague idea of what I'm doing. I was then rather rudely ambushed by some screeching deformed kites, which was a bit concerning, as they managed to spawn inside our building. But even after dealing with said screeching, deformed kites and having built all of the frames, I still had absolutely no idea what to fill in the floors with. So I decided to keep procrastinating and made a few holes in the floor by our water elevator, which would come to serve as my AFK spots. The reason I decided to place them there was because I had been a very silly little war criminal that had completely forgotten to measure the distance between our main structure and our smaller towers. So if I were to AFK a bit higher up in the building, our farms wouldn't be running, which would completely defeat the purpose of going AFK. It is at times like these I am genuinely worried about myself. But after my AFK spots had been dealt with, I created a copy of our world and switched over to creative to figure out what to do with our floors, and finally landed on using 4 different wood types to create a gradient. Unfortunately, I was once again a very silly little man who completely forgot to record it. But anyways, I filled the second floor with dark oak, the third with spruce, fourth with oak, and fifth with birch, which created a bit of a gradient, which I was rather happy with. The individual floors look rather weird, as the contrast between prismarine bricks and some of the wood types look rather off, but in its entirety, I think it looked somewhat okay, which was definitely good enough for me as I was significantly too lazy to try anything else. But now that we finally had all of the floors filled in and usable, I thought it might be a good idea to give us a way to actually access them, as that might be good to do. I didn't particularly want to go for stairs, as that would take up too much space and is a bit of a peasant-like way of handling this situation. So I decided to build a water elevator that was inspired by a post I saw on Reddit, since my level of IQ was significantly too low to come up with a better design on my own. In the aforementioned design, they used trapdoors to have the player stop at each level, which I thought was a rather elegant way of solving my previously mentioned issue. However, I couldn't find the video I saw on Reddit, so I had to take a few creative liberties. So I recreated the elevator in my creative world from memory and filled in some of the blanks using my highly limited problem-solving skills. And rather surprisingly, I did manage to get it to work. And now you might be wondering, why am I not showing the footage of my troubleshooting in my creative world? And the reason for that is quite straightforward, as it is a recurring theme in my videos. I forgot to record it. However, in order to build this elevator, I would need sticky pistons. This was a bit of an issue, as I didn't have any slime balls to my name, so I went off on a journey, with the explicit purpose of exterminating some of the wildlife so that I may build a fancy elevator. I then got back from my heroic expedition and got to building our bubble elevator. The bubble elevator was rather simple, as you'd simply have to stand pressed up to 2 wall blocks, which would shoot you up to the next floor, where you could choose to either continue going up by opening the trapdoor, or to exit at the specific floor by activating a piston which would allow you to access the floor. At this point, I thought it was about time to actually move into our mega base, so I placed in a bunch of chests in our storage area and flew back to our starter base and started packing all of our stuff into shulkers to bring them back to the storage in our mega base. This process was about as fun as it always is moving a ton of items from one place to another, to then sort all of the items into their respective chests. And after what felt like a minute and a half of planking, we were fully moved in. I then remembered that there were actually a few essential farms that I had completely forgotten about, those being a bamboo and sugarcane farm. So I decided to add those farms to the 2 towers that already had some farms in them, and have them feed into the same storage system that we built last episode. However, I decided to cut this bit out of the video, as I can imagine watching someone build what is essentially the same farm over and over again might not be very fun to watch. Also, I couldn't be bothered editing that part, though as we had been working on our base, our villager breeder had managed to pump out a decent number of second-class citizens that we would come to abuse soon in the future. So I decided to take full advantage of that fact and started transporting our future slaves into their respective pods. The first villagers I decided to go for were clerics. The reason for this is that I am most definitely going to need their redstone and lapis trade, and since those trades can't be improved by curing them, I thought it would make sense to start there. However, there was an issue with this rather ingenious plan, that being that we barely had any brewing stands or blaze rods, so I had to fly back to our starter base once again to access the real Nether. I then started flying around looking for a Nether fortress that we could use to gather the crusty cadavers of blazes that we would need for our villagers, which we managed to find after a while. From there, all we would have to do was spawn camping the blazes for them to give us their good rod. And in an attempt at having an average level of brain activity, I decided to block off the walkway to the spawner so that wither skeletons wouldn't be able to surprise me from behind. Okay, that's enough adult jokes for now, and with my pockets full of blaze rods, I made my way back to my mega base and started placing all of the brewing stands for our clerics. I also made myself a brewing area so that I can brew potions without having to go down to our trading hall. But unfortunately, our villager breeder didn't have enough villagers that we needed for our trading hall, so I decided to do some other things in our base to let our breeding slaves produce more offspring for our financial gain. This is something that can probably only be said in the context of Minecraft and still have it be acceptable, which is something that makes me very happy. So whilst we were waiting, I decided to finally deal with the incredibly ugly netherrack floor that was covering our entire main platform. My plan for this netherrack was to convert it to warped nylium, which I thought might look cool, and this was the reason I needed a ton of bones. And whilst we were finishing up the exterior of our base, I decided to also build a walkway out of prismarine, as I thought that would look a bit better. I then switched between working on our exterior and filling in the spaces for our villagers. The second part of the trading hall that we filled up with villagers would become our masons, which had two trades that we were after, those being bricks so that we could make decorated and regular pots, as well as quartz, which I'm sure we will need in the future. And as a nice added bonus, just like the clerics, the mason trades that we are after won't improve by curing them. I then went to FK overnight in order to get as many villagers as possible, as we were only halfway from filling up our trading hall. However, now we needed to start curing our villagers, which meant that we had to get potions of weakness as well as golden apples. We had already managed to brew up some potions of weakness, but we only had 2 golden apples to our name. So in order to get more golden apples, I decided to make our next 2 villagers farmers in desperate hope that they will sell apples. And quite luckily, they did. This meant that we now had a basically infinite supply of golden apples since we have a gold farm. So with that, I started filling up our next section with zombified villagers to then make them all farmers. The reason why we needed farmers was quite simple. Even though we have made a lot of progress on our mega base, we still didn't have a decent source of food as I had been eating the fish that our guardian farm produces. And that setup was a bit too peasant-like for my liking. So the trade that I was after was golden carrots, and since the golden carrot trade is unlocked at the highest level trade, I had to spend a metric ton of emeralds to unlock it, leaving my wallet about as empty as I feel inside. And as we were, once again, waiting for our supply of villagers to replenish, I decided to do something that I am extraordinarily bad at, which is to build custom trees. The exterior we had gone for included a bit of a garden where we could put tall flowers, and as part of the design, I basically had to build a few trees to make it not look weird. However, I did manage to find a pretty good tutorial by a massive YouTuber called Fip, so the trees actually turned out somewhat acceptable, and I decided to use cherry leaves as I thought it would be nice to break up the cyan with something else. And after having dealt with my rather odd custom trees, I was finally able to start filling in our last type of villager, which was our librarians. So I once again got to curing a bunch of villagers and started the process that every Minecraft player enjoys the most about this game, that being placing and breaking lecterns until we are given what we want. Hi everyone, my name is Herkif and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In our last episode, we managed to make even more progress on our base, as it actually has some sort of functionality at this point. However, it still looks like the home of an average government employee, as it's completely void of any personality and details. So we're starting this episode off by doing some work on our interior, which I did by spamming a bunch of decorated pots and putting a cherry wood sapling, followed by cherry leaves. I know, groundbreaking stuff. I also decided to decorate my bedroom as well, in which I used paintings and bookshelves, like the Neanderthal of a builder that I am. But after we've had our interior decorating moment, I decided to be a tiny bit more productive, which I did by enchanting all of the tools in our toolbox, which admittedly should probably have been dealt with a long time ago. But just like with many other things, I had previously left it for future Herkef to deal with in hopes that the task would somehow resolve itself in a very magical fashion, though unfortunately, that didn't happen. So now I'm stuck with this rather mundane task. But nevertheless, I bought all of the books we needed and flew back to our starter base to use our raid farm. This, as you can imagine, took a very long time, but there was a silver lining to this rather monotonous task. Since we were using our raid farm to enchant all of our tools, we also ended up with a bunch of emeralds as well, which I spent pretty much immediately on glass. However, this expenditure was actually quite warranted, as we still haven't filled in the windows of our base, and our next project I had planned needed a bunch of glass as well, so I got to finish up our base's windows like the very good boy that I am. And once done, I returned to my starter base once more, even though we should be completely moved into our new base at this point. But the reason was that our starter base is basically next door to a snowy biome, meaning we would be able to get our slimy hands on some ice. The reason we needed ice was because we needed to fill a large area with water for our new project. And as some of you may have guessed, given that we're collecting all of this ice, as well as the very obvious title, and probably thumbnail of this video, our next project will be a gigantic aquarium. And this aquarium will take up an entire section of our megabase. And now you might be thinking to yourself, why build something so useless in such a usable space? Wouldn't it be better to leave that space so you can build a farm or something else that is useful? And to that, I respond, actually, now that I think about it, you have a pretty good point. But anyways, I made my way back to our megabase and started work on our aquarium. My brilliant master plan I decided to go for in this watery endeavor was to build a layer at the very top of the space I wanted to fill, to then place all the water, and then remove said layer to have it fill up the rest of the tank. I know, I'm very smart. And not only that, my brain then mutated and got a third brain cell, which made me come to the conclusion that I should start off by using netherrack, as I thought it would be nice if I was able to insta-mine the blocks once the top layer of water was in place. However, that brain cell seemed to die rather quickly, as I completely forgot to light up the platform as I was building it. This led to me being bullied by a bunch of pesky spiders. This, paired with the fact that I had to build this entire platform whilst crouching, made for a less than optimal gaming experience. But on a real note, I had absolutely no idea that spiders could spawn in 1.5 block tall spaces. Did you know that? Leave a comment if you did. And if you didn't, just leave a comment, and like, and subscribe. Thanks. But now that we are done being an obnoxious YouTuber for the moment, we can get back to our platform. I unfortunately ran out of netherrack about halfway to finishing the platform, which was rather problematic. So the logical response would probably have been to try to find another block you can insta-mine so that we won't hate our life in the very near future. However, what I decided to do was to make it future Herkif's problem by starting to use black stone slabs, like the very cheap git that I am. And once the platform was finally finished, I started placing all of the ice. I am convinced that there was probably a better way to place the ice than the way I did, but I had unfortunately already spent all of my smart points by coming up with the netherrack idea. Thus, we're unable to do anything smart again, for at least a little while. And quite needless to say, I did indeed hate my life because of my previous choice of using blackstone. But when we had finally finished destroying our platform, To let our water do its thing, I started collecting a bunch of kelp which I was intending to use to convert all of the flowing water to source blocks. I then placed said kelp at the bottom of our soon-to-be aquarium. However, whilst placing the kelp like the very productive citizen I am, I noticed something rather devastating. Since we were using top slabs as our floor, we could actually waterlog them, which would cause water to spill out from below the slab. And by using said water, some of our second-class citizens managed to escape onto the roof of our trading hall, which was very annoying, and following their very tragic and unforeseen deaths, I started filling their slots with new victims. Once that rather annoying and very much avoidable ordeal had been dealt with, I got back and started removing all of the kelp and added some decorations to our inside walls. I decided to go with the exact design of our exterior wall, since I'm not very imaginative. We then got onto the activity that was the main reason we enchanted our tools earlier, which was to collect a bunch of sand. I know, very exciting. My idea for this giant aquarium was to basically make it a coral reef with a bunch of corals and tropical fish, as well as some custom rock spikes. And in order to do that, we had to use sand for the bottom of our aquarium. And since I wanted the aquarium to look a tiny bit more natural, I made a few elevations in said sand. I then prepared for our next step, which was to make a bunch of rocky spikes. So I hopped on a creative world and practiced building them, and tried some stuff out. However, as per usual, I forgot to record that, but here you can see my practice spikes. Fabulous, aren't they? However, as I quite often do, I shot myself in the foot as I decided to use a gradient for our spikes that involved tuff. And since we didn't have a massive amount of the other blocks we needed either, I realized that we had to go for a resource gathering mission. And after having mined a bunch of stone and risked my life to get some tuff, I got to building our spikes. And rather surprisingly, they actually turned out quite good, which I was very happy about. However, since we used gradients for our rocky spikes, they had technically been built using a more advanced building technique than the rest of our base, which was a rather horrific intrusive thought I got now as I'm writing the script. But putting that utterly dreadful observation aside, I went off on yet another resource gathering mission, but this time we collected coral. And after having spent even more time gathering materials, I got to constructing the coral in our aquarium, meaning I had basically just transplanted some of the ocean below my base into my base, which is an observation that slightly diminishes the purpose of this build. But to be completely fair, this build wasn't really meant to be functional or useful, so I digress. In addition to placing the coral blocks, I also decided to place my remaining coral fans on the floor in hopes of adding even more color to the build. I also spammed a bunch of pickles to light everything up, as I thought it would be nice to actually see what we've spent most of this episode building. I then got to bone mealing the floor, which apparently creates coral fans, meaning that us placing all of the coral fans manually was a complete waste of time. But now all that remained was to grab ourselves a bunch of tropical fish to complete this build. So I went down to the local wildlife reserve and stole some of their fish. I also made sure to give them really creative and fun names, fish. But with that project complete, I thought it might be a good idea to build the ceiling of our main living area, which should probably have been done a good while back. My first idea was to have the ceiling be a fog effect using cyan glass with some sea lanterns sprinkled in, which is something I have done in a previous world. However, since I'm running sodium, the fog effect only works downwards, which meant that I was forced to think of something else. So I got the idea to go back to the desert once more and grab some sandstone, as I thought it would make sense with the aquatic theme of our base. And since I couldn't think of any better idea, or rather, couldn't be bothered to think of any others, I decided to go with it. And just to make things a tiny bit more exciting, I sprinkled in some normal sandstone with the smooth sandstone for a bit of texturing, which I was very proud of. I can't say I'm overly happy with the ceiling, but knowing myself, I will most probably never do anything about it as I am very lazy. But to make up for the rather underwhelming ceiling, I decided to install a floor using the cyan fog effect in our teat with a violently erect nipple. So the idea of this fog effect is to start off with a full layer of sea lanterns to then gradually have less sea lanterns sprinkled in with the cyan glass. But in order to do that, we needed significantly more glass than we had to our name. I know, surprising. So I flew back to our starter base once more to use our raid farm to get some emeralds, which we could in turn use for glass. And once the glass was acquired, I got back to building the floor of our teat. The idea I had for this room was to install our Nether portal. The reason for this is that I couldn't think of a better placement for it in our base, and our current Nether portal at the time was still installed inside our villager breeder, which was a rather suboptimal position for it. And once our floor was complete, I started adding the same framing on the inside of our half sphere as we have on the outside of it. That's right, I just called it a half sphere. I'm moving away from the teat bit, as I am a very mature and sophisticated adult. And from there, all we had to do was to deconstruct the portal in our villager breeder and install it in our newly built room. Hi everyone, my name is Herkiv, and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In our last few episodes, we've been doing quite a lot of building, as we've essentially completed our mega base as well as an aquarium, which, granted, has a rather questionable use case. So in today's episode, I decided to switch things up a bit. Since I hated my life last episode when I had to build a rather large platform whilst crouching, I thought it would make sense to go and grab ourselves the Swift Sneak enchantment to combat our declining mental health. And we also need some skulk for our next build that I have planned, so this seemed to be the most reasonable thing to do. However, before going out on our rather epic adventure, I thought it might be a good idea to go grab ourselves some copper. The reason we needed copper was because we've had a few times where we almost had our custom trees get hit by lightning. And a rather fun fact about trees, they are rather flammable. And since I'm not a huge fan of having my stuff destroyed, I thought it would make sense to make a few lightning rods. And once the lightning rods had been installed in a very action-packed and exciting manner, I started exploring in hopes of finding an ancient city. However, it didn't take long before I got distracted by an acacia tree, as I thought we might want it for our future builds. But with the wood acquired, I finally got onto our search of the fabled ancient city. My strategy to find ancient cities is rather straightforward, as I simply dive into random crevasses by mountainous areas. So I flew into one of the crevasses I found by a mountain and found some glow squids. And since we actually needed glow ink sacs, I decided to exterminate the small population I had stumbled upon. I then continued exploring the massive cave and actually found an ancient city, which was very epic. And this is when I realized that I had completely forgotten the fact that the deep dark biome is rather deep and dark, and that it would have been a very good idea to bring potions of night vision. But since I'm very lazy, I couldn't be bothered to go back to my base to brew said potions, so I decided to simply continue. And I went on with the exact same strategy as I always do when looting ancient cities, which is to sneak up to a chest, break it, and fly away in absolute terror. And after a bit of looting, we got ourselves a ward armor trim, which made me remember that armor trims existed. And with that realization, I made the decision that I would try to get both of the armor trims from the ancient cities in addition to the Swift Sneak enchantment, so that I won't have to deal with these ancient cities again in the future. And after a tiny bit more looting, I managed to get a Swift Sneak 3 book, which meant that the only thing left that we wanted was the Silence armor trim, which for context is the rarest armor trim in the game, meaning we would potentially have to raid a bunch more. And after having convinced myself that the best thing I can do with my life is to search for a rare collectible found in a game made for actual children, I continued looting, but alas, no Silence armor trim. I did, however, get the Other Side music disc, which led to a rather nice boost of serotonin. And once I had finished taking possession of someone else's belongings, I flew off once again to find another ancient city. And now you might be thinking to yourself, shouldn't you go back to your base and brew some potions of night vision? That would make it so much easier for us, as the audience, to see what you're doing. And to that, I respond that you are absolutely correct. But anyways, I got on to looting the second ancient city that we had found using the exact same strategy as before. But after having looted our second ancient city, we had still not been able to find the Silence armor trim, which was rather disappointing. Defeated, I got back to exploring in search of yet another ancient city, though shortly after I started exploring, I came across a pillager outpost that had a whopping 12 scarecrows, which was an absolutely insane find. So I grabbed all of the carved pumpkins and set off once more. But at this point, my luck in finding ancient cities seemed to have taken a turn for the worse, as I went on to spend 20 minutes flying into random crevasses without finding an ancient city. And now you might be thinking that 20 minutes isn't a very long time at all, but I happen to not be very patient, so I made my way back to my base and got on with the pleasurable activity of sorting items into chests. I also went on ahead and applied the Swift Sneak 3 enchantment to my leather trousers, which was a huge relief. However, despite having plundered 2 ancient cities, we still didn't have the silence armor trim, which was rather bothersome, so I simply had to continue. But this time, I decided to actually brew some potions of night vision. I know, I'm very smart. I then set off once again to find more ancient cities, though I rather quickly ran into another pillager outpost, which yielded another 4 carved pumpkins. I also decided to have a cheeky little look into their chests in hopes of getting another goat horn, but got rather disappointed. So off I went yet again, and after having spent significantly longer than I wanted to, I finally managed to locate another ancient city. So I drank one of the potions of night vision that I had very intelligently brewed for myself earlier and got to looting once more. And shortly thereafter, I actually managed to get my hands on the silence armor trim, meaning that we would never have to return to another ancient city, which was very epic. Though I did continue looting the ancient city and figured I'd grab some candles, as it's currently impossible for me to get honeycombs as I'm not allowed to use shares. And as you might remember, one of the main reasons we needed to raid ancient cities was to get our hands on some skulk, as we will need it for our next building project. Well, another resource we will need for that project is basalt. However, most farms I found on YouTube were either unfeasible or used TNT duping, which I didn't like. So I decided to try to design my own farm with the goal of making it as TNT efficient as I could. However, I forgot to record that, as per usual, but this is what I came up with. The concept is most likely very similar to farms that significantly smarter people have built, and they have most likely gone about it in a significantly smarter way. And by looking at the redstone, I'm sure you were able to tell that I'm not very smart. However, it did what it was supposed to, so I decided to build it anyway. So I started collecting the things we would need for the farm and flew off to our gold farm, as I thought it would make sense to build the farm right next to it, so that we can have both farms running at the same time. I know, I'm very intelligent, and once I had picked out a spot for our basalt farm, I began constructing it. However, after having 2 out of the 4 basalt generators completed, I realized that one of them was 1 block off, so I had to go back and redo the redstone, which showcased my immense level of intelligence and planning skills. And after an absolutely excruciatingly long time, all of the basalt generators were finally in place. I then covered it all in crying obsidian, so it wouldn't blow up. I then gave it a quick test to see if all of the timings were correct, which, rather surprisingly, they were. However, I then made an absolutely horrifying observation in my creative world. Apparently, I could have used 5 layers instead of the 3 that we had done in our hardcore world, and by doing so, the farm would become significantly more TNT efficient. So I hopped back in our hardcore world and got to work modifying our farm to accommodate 2 additional layers of basalt. This also involved breaking a bunch of the crying obsidian which I had placed earlier, and safe to say, my will to live plummeted rather quickly, but eventually, after a lot of trial and error, we had finally managed to complete our basalt farm. So I flew back home and collected enough sand to make 57 pieces of TNT. I then returned to the farm with said 57 pieces of TNT and activated the farm to test its efficiency. And once my epic AFK session had ended, I returned to 3 full shulkers plus 8 stacks of basalt, which was good enough for me. So now that we had our supply of basalt dealt with, we needed to find a source of skulk, and since I had used up all of my brain cells to deal with the basalt farm, I decided to follow a tutorial made by someone who was actually smart. So off I went to collect all of the materials I would need. The first thing that we had to go out of our way to get our slimy hands on was honey, as the farm required a single block of it. So I flew off in hopes of finding enough beehives to get a block of honey. But rather annoyingly, I couldn't find any beehives at all close to my mega base. So I decided to fly back to my starter base, as I thought I had seen some over there, but got rather disappointed as I couldn't find any damn beehives. But after having another look around, I did manage to spot quite a few, which was very epic. So I emptied them of honey and stole the homes of the seemingly almost extinct local wildlife, in case I would want to involve them in a future slavery operation. And after a while, I managed to craft myself the fabled honey block. So I returned to my mega base once more and started gathering everything that I would need to construct the skulk farm. However, I made the rather horrendous observation that we didn't have any dripstone. I had seen it several times, but had for some reason never picked any up, which was a fact that finally came back to haunt me. so I started flying into random crevasses once more in hopes of finding some dripstone, which for some unknown reason had apparently become one of the rarest things in the entire game. But eventually, I did manage to get some, and with that, I was now ready to build the Skulk Farm. The Skulk Farm that I decided to build was a design by Ray's Works. The idea of that farm is to hook up an Enderman farm to a stone generator to have Skulk be generated with a Skulk catalyst, meaning it would have to be built in the end. So I flew off to our end portal and started building the farm. And once the farm was done, I decided to give it a quick test, and the farm seemed to work perfectly, which gave me an immense ego boost and made me feel very smart. However, that confidence and sense of accomplishment didn't last very long, as the farm stopped converting the stone to Skulk for some reason, which was rather concerning. And since I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, I figured that it was because of the Skulk veins that were now covering pretty much the entire farm. So I decided to attempt to remove the Skulk veins in hopes of fixing the farm. However, since I'm rather dumb and often act against my own interest, I looked at an Enderman, which almost killed me, but with that rather butt-clenching moment aside, I got on to fixing the farm, though this was easier said than done, as this would mean that we would have to stop the Endermen from falling to their deaths and generating more Skulk stuff. So I figured that the easiest way would be to put slabs all over the spawning platform. I then replaced the blocks I used in my dropshoot with slabs so that the Skulk veins wouldn't be able to spread there. And once all of this was done, I removed the layer of slabs from our spawning platform and tried using the farm once more. However, it still didn't convert the stone into Skulk, which was very frustrating. But then I tried breaking some of the Skulk sensors that had generated earlier, and this fixed the farm for some reason, meaning I had risked my life twice and spent a bunch of time for absolutely no reason. Hi everyone, my name is Herkev, and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world, where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In our last episode, we were actually somewhat productive, as we built a few farms that we needed to take on our next project. However, there are a few things that we still need, but before getting too productive, I thought it might be a good idea to write down all of the relevant coordinates on the Nether roof, so that we won't have to look back at old screenshots for reference like some sort of loser. And once that was done, I pretty much immediately forgot what I was supposed to do and decided to make a cobblestone farm. I am not entirely sure why I decided to make a cobblestone farm at this point, as that wasn't one of the things we would need for our next project. However, it's always good to have cobblestone, as we might need it for pistons and other redstone things in the future, so it wasn't a complete waste of time. But nonetheless, I got to designing a cobblestone farm, and when I say design, I actually mean slightly tweaking the design that we used for our basalt farm in our last episode, as I would prefer to not have to rely on my incredibly lacking problem-solving skills. And this time, I actually remembered to record my troubleshooting, which was a big accomplishment for me. But unlike our basalt farm, the cobblestone farm would need to be placed in the overworld, as you can't use water in the Nether. So I thought it might be a good idea to use one of the towers that we had spent an exorbitant amount of time building, but still didn't use for some reason. However, in order to use one of the towers to house our cobblestone farm, we would have to make it significantly more compact, meaning that I did indeed have to rely on my very lacking intellect. And after a while, I had actually managed to make it compact enough to fit in our tower, which was very exciting. However, as I was tinkering with the TNT timer, I came to the very rude realization that the farm was excruciatingly slow, since lava flows 3 times as fast in the Nether than it does in the overworld. the generation of stone was extremely slow, and since I am a man whose time is very valuable, I decided to scrap the design and try to come up with a way to make it faster. However, I still wanted the stone to take on the same shape as our last farm, since I still want it to be as TNT efficient as possible. My main idea was to generate the stone in strips, instead of the single block that our last farm did, as that would make the generation of stone, as well as the stone transportation, significantly faster. The stone would then be pushed downwards to create the same setup of stone that our last farm did. I know, cutting edge technology this is. However, since I am about as smart as an average person who bought the Apple Vision Pro, I had to spend a monstrous amount of time figuring out how I would push the aforementioned strips of stone into the blast area of the TNT. This was an issue since I wanted the farm to generate stone rather than cobblestone, as it is less blast resistant, meaning the farm would be more TNT efficient. And after a significantly longer time that I would like to admit, I remembered that sticky pistons have the ability to pull blocks, which basically solve the issue of transporting the stone strips to the blast chamber. I then set up all of the redstone to have the pistons push all of the stone into our desired shape. But whilst I was tinkering with the timer for our TNT dispenser, I noticed that the stone generators would sometimes generate cobblestone instead of stone, which was rather annoying. However, at this point, I decided that I couldn't be bothered to try to fix it and simply hope that the issue would somehow go away in a very convenient and magical way. So I jumped back into our hardcore world and started collecting all of the things we would need for our farm. And quite ironically, I needed a lot of cobblestone to make a bunch of pistons. And with my pockets full of hard-earned resources, I got on to filling in the floor for our tower. Then began the action-packed segment of this video where I build a cobblestone farm. But as I was building, I realized that I could make the farm even more TNT efficient by filling the roof of our TNT blast chamber with stone, which I decided to do, as I am a very cheap man who would prefer to not have to spend a bunch of time collecting sand, like some sort of peasant. I then flew off to collect some sand and crafted myself one stack of TNT and gave the farm a quick test, and when I was testing the farm, I noticed that the TNT would sometimes break the walls of our blast chamber, so I covered the entire thing in crying obsidian, and once our testing was complete, we had gotten ourselves a tiny bit more than 3 shulkers of cobblestone, which was good enough. But now that we had built our cobblestone farm, I got on to what I was supposed to do earlier, which was to gather materials for our next project. The next thing we needed for that project was deep slate, and we needed a lot of it, as it was one of the main blocks for our palette. This meant that we would have to spend quite a significant amount of time mining the same block over and over again. But after a while of gathering deep slate, I ran into what was probably the biggest vein of diamonds that I had ever seen, which was very exciting. However, since I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor, I couldn't actually collect them, unless I used TNT, which I was significantly too cheap to do. And after having spent a soul-crushingly long time mining, I finally had all of the building materials I would need to get started with our project, or so I thought, but I rather quickly realized that I had completely run out of obsidian, which was yet another thing we needed. And since I was significantly too impatient to use our bartering farm, I decided to go out to the end and collect a bunch of obsidian from ender chests in end cities. And as you could probably tell by the rather obvious name of this video, and most likely the thumbnail, our next project will be a Nether hub, and by looking at the aforementioned thumbnail, you may have noticed that it isn't ocean themed, which goes against what I said in the beginning of this series. However, I did have a reason to choose such an incredibly stupid and tedious starter base, as I thought it would be nice to have a consistent theme in this world, instead of just throwing random bullshit and hoping for the best. The reason for this is rather simple. YOLO. But anyways, here's a time lapse. and after a while, we had made quite a decent amount of progress, as we were basically finished with the basalt and deep slate part of the build. However, in order to progress from here, we would have to go for yet another resource gathering mission. After having seen quite a lot of builds on Reddit, I realized that pretty much everyone was doing gradients, and since I'm very basic and don't have a mind of my own, I decided that I would do the same. The gradient I decided to go for started with dark prismarine and transitioned to stripped warped stem. The first blocks that I needed to go and gather were stripped warped stems and warped planks, so I flew back to my starter base once more to enter the real Nether. From there, I flew over to the warped forest nearby and started collecting the blocks. But after a tiny bit of gathering, I spotted a bastion, and I decided to go in and loot it, since I couldn't possibly think of any scenario where it would go wrong. But for some absolutely miraculous reason, I managed to get out alive with 2 pieces of ancient debris, causing my level of dopamine to skyrocket. I then got on to the purest form of entertainment, that being breaking blocks that are impressively inconveniently placed. But once that was done, I made it back to the safety of our base and gathered up the rest of the things we would need for our gradient, which was rather easy, as I basically just had to gather a bunch of cyan dye, and with that, I was ready to build the remainder of our walls. However, I was also planning on using shroom lights in our ceiling as well as the top portion of our walls, and in a rather unsurprising turn of events, I needed more of them, so I headed back to the real Nether yet again. And when the shroom light situation had been properly dealt with, I got on to some detailing by adding braziers of the soul variety as well as lanterns. I also decided to use anvils as a railing, which is something that I've never done before, as I've never been dumb enough to spend that much iron for absolutely no reason. However, my level of stupidity keeps reaching new heights, so here we are. I then returned to my base for what felt like the 100th time in this episode to collect the final things I would need to complete our project, which was grey glass as well as skulk. However, I had completely run out of ink sacs, as I had used them to make dark prismarine, so I resorted to committing a quick genocide. And since I had been a very smart and talented young man, I actually had quite a lot of glass from when we were trading with the villagers, which was very epic. My plan for the aforementioned grey glass was to place it as our flooring, which would sit on top of a layer of skulk, as I thought that would look cool, so I placed the glass in the manner discussed earlier. Once that was done, I flew over to the skulk farm that we had built in our last episode and gathered some skulk, and once that was placed in and spawn-proofed, our project was pretty much complete. Hi everyone, my name is Herkif, and welcome back to my incredibly stupid hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. In our last episode, we transformed the nether portal leading to our base, in hopes of making it somewhat tolerable to look at, which I think we somewhat succeeded in doing. However, whilst undertaking our transformation, I decided to use a completely different palette than what we've been using before, with the main reason being YOLO, and in said different palette, we used a lot of deep slate, which made me realize that we didn't actually have a dedicated mining area from which we could get our deep slate from, in case we would need it in the future. The main reason for this rather embarrassing oversight is that my past self made the decision to very inconveniently build our base suspended in the air on top of an ocean, which meant that having a mine would be a bit more annoying. So in today's episode, I want to pick out a cave, which will accommodate my future excavations. And now you might be thinking to yourselves, why do you need a cave? Wouldn't it make more sense to just dig down to deep slate, set up a quick portal and call it a day? And the reason behind this decision is that I've decided to make this into a project that is significantly more tedious and excessive for absolutely no reason. And for this project, we're going to need a rather sizable cave. I then remembered that I had rather foolishly plummeted into a rather large cave back when I was gathering tuff for our aquarium, so that was the first cave that I decided to check. However, I was rather quickly faced with the fact that this cave was significantly too small. So my quest to find a large enough cave continued. I then flew into the cave where we found our first ancient city a couple episodes ago, which was pretty much exactly what I was looking for. So I flew back to our base and grabbed myself some obsidian to make a portal and crafted myself a bunch of torches. I then made my way back to the cave and got onto the task of lighting it up in hopes of not getting absolutely demolished by the degenerate hoodlums lurking in the dark. And once I had lit up the cave, like the very responsible and mature adult that I am, I constructed our Nether portal, which we would come to use to access our cave in the future. I then made my way back to my base yet again and grabbed myself a few pieces of moss, which I had rather conveniently acquired from somewhere I am too demented to remember. I then set up a portal on the Nether roof to link up with our cave so that I won't have to fly back and forth like some sort of failure of a human being. As some of you could possibly tell, based on the rather evident title and thumbnail of this video, my plan for this cave is to turn it into an enchanted fantasy-like forest. As of late, I have been binge-watching a small YouTuber called Melmo, who built a magical forest in her last world, and since I am unable to think for myself or do anything original, I decided to resort to some good old copyright infringement. And the first step of my master plan was to cover the entire cave with moss. And after having spent significantly more time than I was originally expecting, the cave was fully covered in moss, meaning we were done with step 1 of this project. For our next step, I intended to replace all torches that we had placed earlier with end rods, on which I could then place a mushroom block. This meant that we needed to find a reasonable source of both things previously mentioned. And since I wasn't very keen on spending hours raiding end cities for end rods, I decided to build a blaze farm. This meant that we would need a blaze spawner, meaning we would need a nether fortress, so I set off in hopes of finding one, but I rather quickly got distracted by a bastion, which I for some reason decided to loot, acting as though I'd had absolutely no will to survive whatsoever. Though, rather surprisingly, I managed to make it out alive with a banner pattern, the pigstep music disc as well as the snout armor trim, which was very epic. However, it then hit me that it might be a good idea to make myself a bit less flammable when going up against a mob that sets you on fire, so I flew over to my gold farm and picked up some potions of fire resistance, which I then upgraded over at my base, then continued the search for a nether fortress, though instead of finding a fortress, I ran into yet another bastion. However, this one had a metric ton of piglins, so I decided that it would probably be quite nice to not die and set off once more. And after a while of flying around like an absolute bellend, I did manage to find a fortress. I started off by looting all of the chests I could see in hopes of getting a rib armor trim, but got rather disappointed, and in a rather surprising turn of events, I had actually done a bit of testing in a creative world in hopes of finding some safety measures to slightly improve my odds of not getting completely annihilated whilst building the farm, and I actually managed to find a way to deactivate the blaze spawner so that I could build the proper facility to accommodate the genocide of the blazes in peace so that I can make some neat decorative custom mushrooms. And once the farm was complete and I had accumulated a decent amount of blaze rods, I made my way to the bedrock ceiling to find a piece of bedrock which I could come back to break when I needed to use the farm again. But in order to craft the end rods, I also needed some popped chorus fruit, so I crafted myself a bow so that I could collect the chorus flowers as well, in case we want to make a farm for it in the future. And now might be a good idea to tell you about my policy on bows. I personally think that bows are a bit too overpowered, so the rule that I've been following in all 3 of my attempts at this challenge is that I'm not allowed to use any enchantments apart from Unbreaking, Infinity, and Mending. And now you might be wondering why I didn't tell you this sooner, and the reason is very simple: I forgot. But anyways, I made my way to the end to grab some chorus fruit, and now that we had all of the end rods that we needed, it was time to grab some mushroom blocks. So I flew back to my starter base once more, as there is a dark oak forest right next to it. Though as I was collecting the mushroom blocks, I remembered that I still don't have the armor trim that can be found in woodland mansions. So since there was a woodland mansion right next to us, I made the same decision that any reasonable adult would, which was to risk my life to get a purely cosmetic collectible that I will most likely never use. My first approach was to break some of the windows in an attempt to cheese the inhabitants inside. However, they seemed to talk a lot of smack for having such a flammable house, so I resorted to arson. I then spent some time watching the mansion get engulfed in flames with immense satisfaction, and as the mansion burned down, I was able to fly in and loot the chests without taking any risks, which was very epic. It is at times like these where Minecraft can teach you some really insightful life lessons. And in this case, we were taught that arson is very profitable. But now that we had both end rods as well as mushroom blocks, I got to replacing all of the torches. And after having spent enough time for us to grow too old for Leonardo DiCaprio, I had finally placed in all of the small mushrooms. Though I rather quickly realized that it was looking about as pleasant as it feels stepping in something wet whilst wearing socks. The main reason being the grass color, as the cave is in a savanna biome. So I decided to try to remove the grass using water, but I quickly noticed that it was excruciatingly slow and decided to try something else. I then remembered the life lesson we were taught earlier and tried setting the grass on fire, though unfortunately, this was an issue that even arson couldn't fix, so I resorted to manually punching the grass to thin it out, like an absolute peasant. This, as you can probably imagine, took a very long time, though once I had finished the peasantry that was forced upon me, I jumped into my creative world. My idea for this cave is to have a giant custom tree, which would house my portal and serve as the main attraction of the cave. However, since I am an absolute Neanderthal of a builder, I decided to practice a bit in creative mode to see if I could build something passable, and after a significantly longer time than I would like to admit, I ended up with a somewhat half-decent tree, and knowing that I lacked the skill as well as the will to live needed to be able to make it any better, I decided that it was good enough. So I jumped back in my hardcore world and got to my new deforestation mission as well as the collection of leaves, then began the construction of my large tree. Now that the main structure of this project was pretty much completed, I got on to collecting a ton of different flowers. The reason for this was that I wanted to use a pretty advanced building technique, that being to spam them everywhere and hope for the best. I then grew a bunch of trees as well as large mushrooms, and with a few more details added, our project was pretty much complete. Or so I thought. I had actually forgotten the entire point of this build, which is to provide a space where I can mine. So I made a mine entrance, and there we have it. the first 1000 days in my incredibly masochistic hardcore world. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh, and feel free to check out the hardcore series that is linked on the screen. Have a good one.